Alright, we're entering into Chapter 4 now of Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty. This chapter continues to talk about the transmission of knowledge through time, whereas the last chapter talked about progress as the way we come up with new knowledge, new ways of solving problems over time, and how inequality plays an important role in that. In this chapter, instead, we talk about tradition and past ideas and how they are so important in causing our current society to run and allowing this sort of progress that is important and allowing the transmission of knowledge among contemporaries. We look at that primarily through the contrasting of two different views of liberalism that Hayek contrasts, what he calls the British view and what he calls the French view. Before I get into that, however, I want to talk more about Hayek's ethics and like his way of justifying this whole sort of thing, which I think I get better from this chapter than I did before. So Hayek, in the very first chapter of the book, talks about how liberty is an ethical good. And talks about that in the introduction, how it is something that's good, and even though this book is going to be mainly utilitarian, he doesn't fall into that camp. But the book just seems so incredibly practical, and he says things like the only way you can make a case for liberty is in this way, that you kind of have to wonder if his belief is actually something like what he says in chapter 1. Oh yeah, violating people's liberty is inherently bad because you're treating people as an end, or as a means and not an end in themselves. Right? He says something that's basically a paraphrase of Kant's categorical imperative back in chapter 1. But ever since then, he says things like, well, there really aren't any ends that are constant throughout human civilization. Instead, the ends that we have are shaped entirely by our culture and by our society, and over time they change because progress happens and occurs and things get different over time. And that's not necessarily good and that's not necessarily bad, but our morality shifts and changes with the time based on the culture we're in because of this evolution of society. And that seems at first, when you read it, like he's being incredibly relativistic, saying, well, there's no such thing as ultimate good or bad, even though he's pro this progress and pro this changing of ends over time. Why not just stick with the ends we have now in the society we have now? Why is this progress a good thing as opposed to a bad thing if progress somehow stands above good and bad and you have different goods and bads at different times? Well, in this chapter, I think we get a better idea of what his view actually is. I think he's a rule utilitarian of some sort. I think his real view is that we should have a moral code who, when we follow it, we provide the greatest good for the greatest number of people. He talks in this chapter about morals and ethics either being beneficial or unbeneficial, and the beneficial ones remaining around, and the unbeneficial ones falling away. So I think what he's aiming at is, hey, let's have a moral code that provides something like the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and a strong society that continues on into the future. And the moral code that's going to do that is not going to be one that we can rationally come up with and articulate and impose upon society, but instead the moral code that's going to do that is going to be the one that we generate with this sort of historical evolutionary paradigm, where some societies adopt one moral code and some societies adopt another, and the one that's more successful, other cultures that were less successful adopt their moral code. And so it's not just in terms of morals, but I think that's probably the best way to understand Hayek. His contention is we need to have rule utilitarianism, but it's impossible for us to come up with the rules. The best way for us to come up with the rules then is to let the experiment of civilization run and generate moral and ethical codes for us, which we're not smart enough to test whether they're true or false or figure out whether they're true and false. But just history tells us, based on where we're at in history, whether we've got a pretty good one or a pretty bad one. And so we should just use it. We should be very hesitant about questioning it because our mental faculties aren't up to snuff to challenge this sort of historically generated knowledge that's bigger than any particular human minds, and we should stick with that. Okay. So now that we've talked about that for 5 minutes, and I think I've got a better handle on where Hayek is actually coming from ethically when it can seem so confusing at points, let's talk about tradition, and let's talk about the British versus the French. So, on the British side of things, we have Adam Smith, we have David Hume, we have John Locke. We have people who, according to Hume, are categorized by actually living under a system of liberty. Right? They live under the common law, and so their attempts to explain liberty and justify it are empirical attempts in his mind. They look at the world around them that they live in, and they attempt to explain why it's been successful, how it's gotten that way, and the like. Whereas the French are essentially copycats. When they start talking about liberty, they're trying to look at the British system and explain it the same way the British did, but they think, because they didn't live under it, and they're not going about this empirically, that it can be rationally designed and planned, and that you could come up with a system like the common law, like a system of liberty enforcing laws out of your mind, and that you can provide them for people. Now, in his mind, he calls this the empiricist view, the British view, and the rationalistic view, the French view. I see where he's coming from. I think that might be a little bit of a misuse of the terms empiricist and rationalist. I think he uses quite a bit of rationalistic style reasoning in this book, right? Most of his arguments are not empirical. They're not based on looking at the external world and drawing conclusions from that. They're based on sort of mental categories of, well, what's right and what's wrong. Even if you are going with this utilitarian sort of view, that's not something you can get purely empirically. And I think he should know that. He is an empiricist. His book, The Sensory Order of Perception, my understanding is that it's an attempt to explain how the neurology of the brain takes in sensations from the external world, like empirical sensations, and creates like the categories that we have in our mind on the basis of those perceptions. So he is an empiricist, but I'm not sure you could just say that, well, these views of government that are based on emergence of systems over time, or these views of society based on emergent systems over time, are empiricist, because they don't seem particularly empirical. They seem like they're things that you thought about based on economic categories and came up with. They don't seem very heavily based in observation of the external world. Whereas on the other hand, the sort of French views he talks about, maybe you can say, oh yeah, these people believe the power of the human mind can create these sort of great rules in societies. But I think a lot of the people who are trying to do that sort of work today are empirical about it, right? They would want to go around and they would want to do all sorts of econometrics and statistical tests and come up with rules that way, not through the powers of your mind. So I'm not sure tying this evolutionary view versus this rationalistic view to the terms empiricism and rationalism is a good idea. But anyway, he does it. So maybe I'll call it British and French instead of empiricist and rationalist. So anyway, he levies two different criticisms against the rationalists, which I think are a bit contradictory. So the first one, he accuses the rationalists of necessarily becoming totalitarian. And so he uses this example of Descartes, who Descartes said that the greatest government in the ancient world was Sparta, because Sparta's laws, they might not have all been good on their own as like individual particular laws, but together they all thrust towards this common good and this common goal that all of the laws are aiming for, and so they're super successful. Whereas if you look back at other ancient Greek writers, or Roman writers, like Cato the Elder, who says, no, our society is so successful not because we have one set of laws put down by one person or group of people aiming at a particular goal, but rather we're incredibly successful because our constitution developed over many, many hundreds of years and was changed and molded, and we got to have the wisdom of multiple generations and not just one. And so he says, well, the rationalists, since they believe that if you have this good goal in mind, you can create good rules and base your society around them, and have everybody follow those rules and have a wonderful society, that they're necessarily going to end up with a society like Sparta, where everything is planned top down and everyone has to fit into this particular mold, and you shouldn't try these differing forms of options for people in this sort of experimentation that he's lauded up till now. At the same time, he accuses the rationalist view of society, which like the French view in his book and in reality is something more like liberty isn't freedom from coercion of other men, but rather it's freedom to select your own leaders. So you vote in people to power, that person is the voice of all the different people, and they select the goals and come up with the rules, and society then follows them, and you have that sort of political liberty. is the way Hayek talks about it here. But he also accuses them not of being just totalitarian, but also of being anarchistic on the opposite end of the spectrum. He says that, well, this sort of rationalism, when you take it to its most logical extreme, and the defenses of liberty that they give, leads to you thinking that all government intrusions are evil, and so you shouldn't have any at all. So those two criticisms seem to me to be a bit contradictory. Okay. I'll quickly go over his two other critiques of rationalism. So one of them is rationalists require that you demonstrate everything that you believe is true. And so they want justifications for all the systems in society and all the different beliefs people hold, instead of simply saying, and like they'll call them superstitions if they're not proven true. Whereas Hayek thinks, no. If something has been in use by society for a long time, there's probably a reason. The fact that we can't wrap our minds around it doesn't mean that it's not based on past experience that's been folded into things. So you should ask for, why do we do this? But if you don't get a reason, that doesn't mean you immediately abolish it and throw it out. Instead, the burden is on the people who want to change society to show that something else works better, or to show that the previous idea is false. The burden isn't on society to justify all of the different things we do, because that's impossible, because it's created in a spontaneous way. It's not designed in the first place. It's created by human action, not human design. He also criticizes them for replacing the word moral with the word social. And it ties into this. So when people talk about social morality, they're saying, well, when you decide what to do, you shouldn't just be thinking about whether it's right or wrong by the rules society has put into place. Because again, he thinks that those rules are created in such a way that they best uphold utility over time, in this sort of experimentation sort of a way. He says that the rationalists, they don't want you to follow those rules that society has tested to be good in a utilitarian way. Instead, they want you to try to think through the rules and see if they will be good in a utilitarian sort of way. So he's sort of advocating here for not a straight utilitarianism way of thinking about ethics, but more of a rule utilitarianism way, where the rules are not arrived at rationally, but they're arrived at by society creating them over time. Okay. So really, basic thrust of this chapter is the same thrust that we've seen before, where you have this sort of evolution in society, and he does make explicit here that evolution is not biological evolution. He thinks evolution, in like a Darwinian sense, stole this from social science, who came up with it first. And he doesn't think it's natural selection, he says explicitly, because people aren't dying and societies aren't dying off. Rather, it's a system of testing and adoption. All right. So he closes off with two ideas, both of which I think are immensely more powerful than the main thrust of the chapter. So one is that moral rules are super important to have, but not all moral rules should be enforced by government and by laws, because you need to allow people to experiment, to break those rules, and suffer the consequences, right? They're important rules that society has generated over time for a reason, but those reasons may now be obsolete in his view. Or maybe those reasons aren't obsolete, but maybe there's a better way that hasn't been tried before. So people should be free to use their knowledge to test those, suffer the social consequences of them if they think they have a really good reason for doing it, because who knows, they might be right and society might adopt this better thing. And so he thinks that in the same way that we should have rules for society, we should also have rules for government, and rules about the sorts of things that government can make illegal, and rules for the sorts of things they can't make illegal, because those are areas where testing and further growth is possible. And I think that's a very interesting way to put it. And finally, he ends with saying, you know what? I've been really tough on using reason in this chapter in order to come up with rules for society, but I'm not saying reason is bad. I'm simply saying reason is limited. And reason can't be outside of the system and social structure that generated it and created it in the first place, so it needs to be delimited by that sort of society. All right. So what lesson should we take from this chapter? The lesson we should take from this chapter is there are social institutions that are useful that we don't know the purpose of, and we shouldn't attempt to design society from the ground up. What lesson should we take from this chapter because we think Hayek might be wrong about things? I think that the main issue with this chapter is that you come to that conclusion, in my opinion, in a primarily rational way, by thinking about what we can know and what we can't know, and not by empirically looking at the past and seeing that some things work and that other things do not work. All right, have a wonderful day. There probably won't be another one of these videos for a while because I'm going back to work very soon. But yeah, If you're watching them, I hope you've enjoyed them. I've certainly enjoyed making them. Thank you.